Hello and welcome to a brand new Arseblog Arsecast right here on arseblog.com. How are you? Hope you're well. Thank you very much indeed, as always, for being here. It is episode 808. If you know, you know. Am I right? Sometimes I am. Not always, but sometimes. Anyway, we are back after what feels like quite a long interlull, but football begins again on Saturday when we host Nottingham Forest at home. At the time of recording, we don't have any new information, any news. It's been such a quiet week. We don't have any news on the injured players. How is Leandro Trossard, who went off injured for Belgium during the interlull? How are Bukayo Saka, Declan Rice, Takahiro Tomiyasu, Ricardo Calafiori? These are questions that we're all desperate to find out the answers to. And right now, we don't have any of that info. Mikel Arteta will meet the press on Friday. We might get a bit of insight into who might be available for the Forest game when he holds his pre-game press conference, but that's not till about 1:30. So there's not much from an Arsenal perspective going on this week. So we do have something a little bit different today. There is, an Arsenal element to the conversation. It is, of course, based around football, and I'll give you more details now in a couple of minutes. But I did just want to remind you, if you're an Arsecast Extra listener, you know this already, but we have launched brand new Goodly Morning mugs. They are on sale now. You will find a link to the mug in the show notes. And as we did the last time we launched and sold some mugs, we are going to give every single penny that we make from them to charity. So all the proceeds from these mugs will go to good causes, just to let you know what they are, because we hadn't quite finalized them. So James picked a charity and I picked a charity as well, and we'll split the proceeds 50-50 between these two great causes. Mine is Oscar's Kids, which is a national childhood cancer charity, which does amazing things for kids with cancer and the families of those children as well. And James has picked Children's Hospices across London. It's a group of 6 hospices that support children and young people with life-limiting and life-threatening conditions and their families. So if you buy a Goodly Morning mug or 2 or 3, whatever it is, not only do you get what is, essentially the finest mug on the planet, you'll be helping these great causes and the incredible work that they do for very sick children and their families. I think it is important, and I've said this before, I think it is important when you have a platform like Arseblog, and we're very fortunate to have the platform that we do. We're very grateful to all of you for being part of it, for being part of the community, for listening, for reading, for being Patreon members, whatever way you are part of it. We really, really appreciate it. And a way for us to really demonstrate that appreciation is to give a bit back, particularly around this time of year when we look forward, let's say, to a nice festive period. And these kids and these families can't really experience that in the same way. So if you're interested, if you'd like to buy a mug, if you'd like to help out, as I said, the link is in the show notes. And once again, thank you very much indeed for being here. Right, let's get on with today's show. And my guest has written a new book. It is called States of Play. In very, very broad terms, it's about sports washing, but it is much more complicated than that. There are so many aspects to that one phrase, and with me to unpack some of that is the author Miguel Delaney. Hi, Miguel.
Oh, thanks for having me, Andrew.
My pleasure. I've been reading this book, and it is, I have to say, fascinating and extraordinarily complicated. So I wanted to ask you first and foremost about, sitting down and doing the work and putting this together. It must have been at times an absolute head wreck, even if what you're writing about and what you've brought to the page is so important.
Oh, thank you. I have to say, there were moments, particularly around December to March this year, where I remember sitting there at 4 a.m. over what's supposed to be a Christmas break, trying to distill the more complex parts of the book related to some of financial regulations into something readable, and I suppose that is at least some way, well, for want of a better word, sexy. So there was a lot of that. But yeah, because I think the absolute key, and ultimately why I'm writing it, is, love for the game, concern for where the game is going. And also, I think it's important to try and show and articulate why all of these issues And I suppose this shows how kind of football journalism and coverage of football itself has morphed. But why these issues affect what happens on the pitch. And it's funny, actually, because the exact point when I started properly researching it is relevant to listeners of the pod. Like I've been covering these issues for years, but when I started to really get into the research, it was when Arsenal had, I suppose, what was their first title run-in against Manchester City. And I was writing about that at the time. And the initial call there, especially around the 2-2 draw at West Ham and what happened after that, was that the team bottled it, all of this. And I did, even then, I was of the mind that, well, right, you can apply a lot of kind of traditional football thinking and narratives to this, and to an extent that's fair. But it's in a completely distorted world now, where football is trying to deal with greater powers and how that's affected the game. And it's sometimes like when I'm trying to argue, I suppose, why people should be interested in the book or why they should read it or engage with it, is because it is almost to try and show why, for 99% of football fans, your team won't win.
Well, I mean, that's very true. And I think, Arsenal's title challenges in the last couple of years, maybe that's something we can talk about in a few minutes, because I think there is clearly a discussion to be had around Manchester City and the dominance that they've had in the Premier League, but we're sort of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. I think what's interesting about this is, like, I've seen the book described as, well, this is all about sports washing. And that's sort of a blanket term for things that people understand, and they might apply that to Manchester City, they might apply that to PSG, they might apply that to World Cups or Newcastle United, those kinds of things. But I think there's a part in the introduction where you say the story isn't at its core sports washing, it is the extreme economic politicization of football, where the sport has become terrain for geopolitical positioning that it really should have been protected from, which is a bit of a mouthful. Sports washing, you can understand, rolls off the tongue a little bit better, but I mean, it is right there. And at the top of the book, there's it's sort of like, I don't want to say it's like Game of Thrones or one of those books, but there's a cast of characters at the start, and you list people from Vladimir Putin, David Beckham, Pep Guardiola, Silvio Berlusconi, Lionel Messi, even Stan Kroenke is in there. And there's a list of names that people will recognize from football, from sport, and from politics, who all play a big part in the story of this book.
Yeah, and I suppose that speaks to the kind of variety of influences on it as well. And yeah, the phrase sports washing, I mean, the second chapter of the book is all about what that actually means. I mean, I pretty much argue the phrase isn't fit for purpose anymore, even because the word wash in it is almost too kind of light a description of what is actually going on here. But for the moment, it is useful shorthand for what I suppose it seeks to convey, because it's difficult to find a phrase that sums this up. I've spoken to all sorts of people, from those in human rights to geopolitics to even people who work in the kind of wider football business industry, I kind of suppose distilled all of that into one kind of usable description of the phrase, or at least sports washing in this form, which is essentially the centrally planned political use of sport to normalize autocratic states, and crucially states of immense and historically unprecedented means, because that is crucial to this and what they can do, for the purpose of perpetuating authoritarian structures without the need for reform. Again, a mouthful, but essentially we're talking about the political use of sport, or political use of football for other methods, essentially for motivations that aren't what the sport is for. And I mean, from that initial kind of digging into sports washing, which I had been writing about for a while, particularly as regards ownership and the Qatar World Cup, and I thought that was worthy of coverage anyway, and worthy of a book in itself. But then, like, you instantly realise, and I kind of inherently knew this myself from researching and writing it, you can't talk about sports washing without talking about the wider context of football. And that is a game that's in, even before the introduction of these states, was already in a strange place. And I mean, again, Arsenal are actually central to this story. If you think about an absolutely key moment in football history, and a key moment in the history of Arsenal as a club as well. So Wenger having essentially caught up with Ferguson's United. And it should be actually remembered that was, because I go into all of this as well, Ferguson's United, who were the first to really take on football's economic model and this immense concentration, or immense commercialisation of the game that was again, historically atypical at that point. Wenger had done the hard part of catching up with United. They created this great rivalry, and then he tries to move the club onto the next step, which is the construction of the stadium in Ashburton Grove. And of course, what happens in between the planning and the finalisation of the project? Well, Roman Abramovich buys Chelsea, and we can talk about that a lot more liberally than we could over most of his ownership due to what's happened since. And that completely transforms the economy of football. And so I suppose, now when I try and distill the book, and there are a lot of themes in there, a lot of different strands you kind of try to bring together to explain where football is now. I suppose it's pretty much this. It's that over 30 to 40 years, the game has been transformed by three main forces. One, and the most influential now, geopolitics and autocratic states. Two, an embrace of a very specific form of, I'd say, Western capitalism. And three, its own regulatory failure and the failure of its authorities. I mean, principally FIFA and UEFA. And all of that has come together to, I suppose, very much change what we're seeing on the pitch for some good, but also a lot that feels is a bit of a turn-off with the modern game.
Sure. I mean, I want to come back to that because I do think there is something fundamental that we need to talk about when it comes to the game and when it comes to fans. You mentioned that rivalry between Arsenal and Manchester United back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think what was when you think back on it now, there was this idea, well, Manchester United are this super rich club, and they sort of got criticised, or there was a perception that, like, they were ahead, they were using their finances for their own benefit, as they were perfectly entitled to do, because this was money that they were basically generating themselves, because they were the first club to really, really recognize the commercial aspects of the game. Therefore, it gave them this financial strength and this financial power. And it does feel like sort of more innocent times, doesn't it? You know, that perception of United as being this financial behemoth, nowadays, you would look at that and say, that is perfectly respectable, what they did. And, that is kind of the way the game should have continued. But like you say, Abramovich came along in 2005, 2003, sorry. By 2005, Chelsea were champions for the first time. And it completely and utterly skewed football ownership, the transfer market, the wages, all of it. That one purchase, and I know you explain this in the book. You go back a bit further and you talk about Berlusconi in Italy and recognizing the need for, the idea that AC Milan should go out of the European Cup in the first round. This is nonsense. Nobody wants to see that. Take away the jeopardy of a cup competition. And therefore you create the Champions League. And he was one of the first to recognize that. But Abramovich, to me, feels like the moment where football changed irrevocably, and it's sort of like opening the stable door and all the fucking horses have bolted.
Absolutely. And a key indicator of that, whatever about the spending, is also when Abu Dhabi came to buy Manchester City, Abramovich's purchase was specifically mentioned in negotiations about what this did. And yeah, it did, like, even before you get to this kind of political level, there's a very basic way to illustrate just how much Abramovich changed the economy. And it isn't even kind of the fact he spent 100 million in that first summer. It's also say at that point, and this was post ITV Digital, the football economy was in kind of a little bit of a struggling place. And as we saw with the case of, say, Leeds, a lot of clubs were struggling to pay wages because they'd committed so much wages, and also agreeing transfer fees and installments where they weren't fully sure if they could make the second installment. This is basically why UEFA ended up introducing financial fair play. But when Abramovich came in, not only can he make all these payments, but say he agrees to buy Joe Cole from West Ham, it's not just that he pays all up front, it's that the money is in West Ham's account within half an hour. And I know that sounds like such a simple administration thing, but that was huge for where football is at the time. And again, as you say, Manchester United and what they were doing, and it does seem quaint, even though they did have this financial superiority, but also because of where football was at that point, because its economy was not as expanded, because there weren't the same gaps that were allowed to develop. And that is one other reason why the introduction of oligarchs and states caused the transformation. But if you think about that, I mean, it's that early 2000s period. Manchester United are even though they've won the European Cup in 1999, and that was when England was actually, the Premier League was the sixth by coefficient in Europe, so there was an element of kind of overachieving to it. But say they're still having tough games in Europe against clubs like Lens, Panathinaikos. And we remember Arsenal's struggles in the Champions League group stage at that point, and that is because it wasn't any real failures in the club, although there are other factors like post-Heysel and adapting to Europe. But really, it's because there just weren't the same gaps between European clubs. And it does feel like it was a much healthier sport, at least in terms of the competitive vitality, that there was a real kind of a refreshing nature. You could go to a lot of countries in Europe and be guaranteed a challenge of a game playing against what was still a good team. I mean, again, one of the classic illustrations of that is, I mean, before you even get into the invasion of Ukraine, but what happened to Dynamo Kiev long before that?
Yeah.
They'd gone to a team who were one of the most exhilarating in Europe, really. Like they repeatedly put together these 11s that had great players in them, that played great football, that were competitive, that could win. And that, by about a decade after Abramovich, probably less, that's actually impossible because of the way that the sport has just, its economy has expanded. And also, of course, it's not just states and oligarchs. It's also because football's own model has, it bakes in concentration of wealth by design. And what does concentration of wealth do in an era where you've got the internet, where you can suddenly check the highlights of any club around the world within seconds on your phone? Well, it means that a certain group of clubs or certain countries can go bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's less space for everyone else. And that's, I suppose, a bit of a lesson in modern football as well.
Yeah, I mean, you say in the book that there are 12 clubs who generate or are equal to 1/4 of all European football revenue or the economy. There's a very small number of clubs. And I think what we're seeing these days is that leagues are becoming less and less competitive. And it's sort of hard to parse that in a way because, as Arsenal fans over the last couple of years, we've had these title challenges. We've gone toe-to-toe with Manchester City. Was that competitive? Absolutely. We competed. We didn't quite have enough to get over the line, as Liverpool did in the previous seasons, where one time they had enough to get over the line. Every other time they were beaten out by Manchester City. There is competition, but ultimately the success has become concentrated in a very, very small number of clubs, as we see in France, as we see in Germany, as we've seen now in the Premier League with Manchester City winning 6 out of the last 7. So that impact on how the game has gone is, I mean, it's not good for the game. And I know that, like, I'd sit here and if I was, if Arsenal were champions, I could talk about how who cares about it being good for the game if you win the title. But even Spain, when you look at the dominance of Real Madrid and Barcelona, the only club to have won the league outside of those is Atletico Madrid, whereas previously you had clubs like Valencia, like Deportivo, who were able to win La Liga, and that's just no longer the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And people go on, it was always like this, usually to defend the current status quo. Well, it's an empirical fact. It's never been like this. And suddenly we're in a situation where I think it's close to half of European leagues have, in the last 2 decades, have gone through the most intense spells of dominance in their history. And you mentioned 2 of them there, I suppose, Bayern Munich winning 11 in a row, Juventus winning 9 in a row. And again, that comes back to this same issue. In Germany alone, say, it was up until this run from Bayern, they'd never gone more than 3 titles in a row, which kind of feels almost amazing now. And it's not that long ago. And you had clubs like Stuttgart, Schalke, winning the league. Even if you go back to another key moment, which was the Bosman ruling, that's not that long ago again. It's the mid-90s. And who were the champions in Europe? Nantes in France, Blackburn in England. And Spain had that was just before a period where it was Deportivo and La Coruña and a great Valencia side who Arsenal played in the Champions League, who were creating this new duopoly. And I think there's an important point there because, as you say, there is a competitiveness, and I appreciate for Arsenal fans, if they got over the line the way Liverpool did, it would feel like it would probably feel like 1989 again to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But it's if you suddenly if there's a run then where it's 7, 8 in a row, and this is the issue, I think, even for clubs like, say, like Munich. One of the consequences of winning so much is that winning actually means much less. Like, it's not healthy for football in that way, because it's another empirical fact that, and 40 years of like the most intense research shows this, that these days, and it's all the more of an issue because there's so much money in the game, the league table or your league position, there's a 90% correlation with wage bill. So when there is such money in the sport, it's suddenly, and this is what's so problematic for me, it's the extent to which the off-field and pure finance dictates the results we see and the way the table finishes. Again, in a way that was never seen before in football, because there just weren't the same gaps. And that's why it's such an issue. And I think that essentially explains why Arsenal have actually, say, overperformed to compete with City twice, and especially last season to get to 89 points and to still not win the league is, I suppose it just speaks to where football is.
Let's talk a little bit about the Premier League, and you've written about FIFA and UEFA, and we'll come to those in a few minutes. But when you talk about people who have authority in the game, the Premier League, and its fit and proper persons tests and all those kinds of things. I mean, when you think back, and we've talked about Abramovich as being that sort of tipping point or turning point anyway, certainly in how the game has gone. And there'd be some people who say that the Premier League failed in its duty to the game by allowing that kind of ownership. And by allowing that kind of ownership, by extension, they've allowed all kinds of ownership. They welcomed all the money in because I think they saw an opportunity. And Richard Scudamore, who was the chief executive of the Premier League at that time, was certainly very open to anything that could make the Premier League more money and enhance the global appeal of the Premier League. At the same time, though, like, if the Premier League had resisted, if the Premier League had said to Abramovich, no, you can't, if the door was closed to billionaires and oligarchs and nation states, is it fair to say that they would have just gone somewhere else to make that happen? Because inevitably the money is going to find a way into the game, whether it's through England, whether it was through Spain, France, Italy, wherever. I
think this is the Premier League's very convenient argument. And I think they're actually looking at it the wrong way around. And ironically, almost not giving themselves due credit. I mean, why were figures like Abramovich or states like Abu Dhabi, why were they interested in the Premier League? Well, it was because it was already, for various other reasons, it was already at a point where it was growing to this global supremacy. It wasn't quite there yet, and it arguably took Italy to go through Calciopoli and all this, but the direction of travel, it was only going one way. It's not the involvement of these interests that has made football. They're attracted to what football already was and to its immense global appeal. I mean, this is the kind of tragic reality of football, really. It doesn't need all this external investment to be what it is. It generates enough of it on its own. It doesn't share its existing money out well enough, which then creates all these arguments about, say, well, you need a big rich investor to compete, which is incredible given that England for 80 years had been one of the most democratic leagues, arguably in the world. And that was because of regulations that these days would be considered almost kind of American witchcraft. I mean, they realized that the ABC of football straight away when the league was set up was that you have to put on competitive games. So what was one way they did that? Well, they saw that gate receipts were obviously the main source of income. So they created this regulation to say that 20% of all gate receipts had to go to the opposition. And what that instantly did was mitigate against the power of big city clubs. And that's why a Real Madrid or Juventus could never develop in England. It's why up until Manchester City, no one did 3 in a row, and 3 in a row was rare. And it's why Huddersfield, say, were able to win the league. Well, it had such a great breadth of winners. And obviously, to come back round, I mean, football is football. It has this, it's such a simple game to play, which means, and anyone can play it, which means everyone, or at least more people across the world love it more than anything else. I quote Tom Holland, the historian in the book, saying that there's actually a very strong argument, a very strong evidence that football is the most popular cultural pursuit that's ever existed. There's never been as many people interested in one thing as much as football, which obviously gives it a financial power, a political power, and a social power. And that's what these states were attracted to. And I think, you mentioned the Premier League's regulations. Well, why did Abramovich buy Chelsea and not somewhere else? Well, one key example here is that he couldn't buy Barcelona or Real Madrid because they were ring-fenced. So he went to where the most easily available club was. And England has long been known as, whatever about its kind of the strength of its league, it's also very easy to buy into. And that is because of long-term deregulation, a deregulation that involves the erosion of rules like sharing gate receipts.
Isn't there something counterintuitive about the fact that football inherently, or football clubs, let's say, are not massively profitable organizations? Because there is a demand. I mean, even, in the business world, there are probably dozens of industries and dozens of or hundreds, thousands of companies who generate far, far more in terms of profits for their owners. Yet football has attracted the wealthiest people in the world. The wealthiest from every corner of the globe, from American billionaires to nation states to oligarchs, as we've said. But, there is a demand, I think, from fans of football clubs. If they have any money, you got to fucking spend the money on players. And so there's something about this idea that these incredibly, some might say obscenely, wealthy people have bought into an industry, not because they want to make money.
No, yeah.
And some of them, let's be fair, some of them may well have I want to win things as a sporting, this is a part of my sports franchise. I want to win things. I'm interested in sports. But as we know, and as you lay out very clearly in the book, there are other reasons why these people want to be involved and own football clubs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, there is a strand of American ownerships. Arsenal have one of them. Manchester United have one of them. Liverpool have one of them. The big three, really. And what they want to do is basically they want to maximize the potential profits from this immense global interest in their clubs. That's pretty much why they're there. That's all there is to it. States, what they want is primarily the political and social capital that comes out of football clubs, because again, it's such a powerful thing. And there's quite a simple example here, actually, to give, I suppose, and I suppose this cuts across the sports washing point too, or at least sports washing in its most rudimentary form. So, since I've written the book, although I touch on this a little bit in it, but in the last few weeks, there's obviously been this discussion around the football industry, not just outside, that the Saudis, they're not doing with Newcastle what they've done, say, with the Saudi Pro League, with Live Golf.
I was going to ask you about that because, it strikes me, as before we talk about Manchester City a little bit, that they have been pretty low key. Yeah.
But so there is. Look, no one from PIF has said it. They would still say they want the club. They've got long-term plans for it. But even say if they did sell it, well, there'll be this argument or debate over whether it was worth it. Well, I mean, I would say, human rights people would say, and a lot of people in geopolitics would say, it's been absolutely worth it for Saudi Arabia or PIF, because you can put it in the simplest terms. Who's talking about Jamal Khashoggi now? Yes, it will come up at the anniversary. But if you compare the discussion around Newcastle now to, say, the furore when they initially tried to buy the club in the middle of lockdown in 2020, well, it's incomparable. And that's what purchasing these clubs does. They've got basically this normalization power because football is such a part of the fabric of society. And there are, of course, all sorts of other benefits in terms of buying clubs. But I think that illustrates the strength there. And there's a great line that Gareth Farley gave me for the book, and people might know him from keeping Everton up on the last day of the 97-98 season. He's now actually a very successful sports lawyer who works a lot in kind of football regulation and what's healthy for the game. And as he put it to me, football has actually become, or at least the business of football, is the commodification of feeling. And I suppose that commodification can be either in terms of purely financial, or it can be translating it into to social or political effect.
Well, that ties into fans as well, doesn't it? So let's talk a little bit about Manchester City, and I'm sure you've had plenty of feedback from Manchester City fans about the things that you've been writing in this book, because you haven't just been writing them in the book. You've written many articles about them for The Independent. But, Manchester City as the sort of flag bearers, if you like, or the standard bearers for what people would consider sports washing in the Premier League, Like, there's no question that what they've done has been really slick, extremely well executed. They've brought in the best people behind the scenes. They have the best manager in world football. They have some of the best players in world football. And they have created this incredibly efficient, incredibly polished football team. And of course, that is inextricably linked with the money. That is inextricably linked with what they've spent on the pitch, what they spent off the pitch. And it has brought them this incredible success/dominance. And yet, this feeling about what Manchester City have done and achieved, it leaves so many people just absolutely cold. It's like artifice for so many football fans.
Well, I mean, before you even get into kind of the bigger questions about, sports washing or human rights or the purpose of it all, some of that actually comes back to what we were saying earlier about, say, like, if Bayern Munich win all the time, what does it actually mean? And like, it's that sense of what sport should be. There has to be a feeling of kind of struggle that actually means something to get there. That's where the real kind of the value in sport comes. And I know City fans will point to 2012 and everything that meant, the Aguero goal, but that's a mere 4 years after they were an absolute basket case of a club. And I think that shows exactly what we're getting to. It's this sense that it's not like what is the City story, and what's the kind of, say, the moral lesson, like anything comparable, say, like Ferguson bringing through the class of '92, or Wenger kind of revolutionising the approach at Arsenal, but like even in terms of kind of tactics and nutrition to create something different. Like with City, it is like the story is basically just an autocratic state has looked around football and sought to put in as much money as it could until it created this. Like, is that what sport is for? Is there value in that? And then you get into, of course, what they're actually doing it for, which is, of course, all these political aims. And it's interesting there as well. I kind of like I consider this a lot, especially what has become of Barcelona. But like a strand I keep picking at in the book is just why Pep Guardiola's 2008-2012 team was probably the most influential side of all time. Not just for the football it played, but also because of its political effect, and again, this happens at a key moment in, I suppose, modern history, given the spread of the internet, broadband, people can look at all these teams like within seconds on their phone. And it wasn't just admiration for that Guardiola side, obviously, it was adulation. And what happened? Well, pretty much every autocratic state who had this interest in football, who wanted to kind of extract this political and social benefit for it, they looked at that and said, I want that. So Abramovich spent years trying to get Guardiola. City didn't just go and get him. They got pretty much everyone around him, all of the kind of the key executives from that Barcelona team, put them in place and built the perfect... I mean, it's why people always go on about this, like say, and I've heard this a lot, obviously. You're overplaying it. It's just, this is all Guardiola. If Guardiola goes, City will never be as good. That's to miss the point. Guardiola isn't separate from the spending. He's not someone that's been imposed on top. He's absolutely central to it. They saw what they thought was basically like the Apple of football, isn't Apple the company, or his perfect vision, and went all out to get everything about it. And even Guardiola, he hasn't had the concerns he's had off pitch, say at Barcelona or Bayern Munich, and to just given this almost hermetically sealed conditions to just go about creating what he wants. And the great irony is that he's probably created his best ever teams and purely how they function. They're not as dependent on an individual as they were with Messi, but it just doesn't inspire the same emotion as Barcelona did, because it doesn't mean the same thing.
No, absolutely not. And you're right, that sort of plan that they put in place for 2 or 3 years to build everything to the point where it was the perfect time for Pep Guardiola to arrive, at which point, City's dominance basically began. I know they didn't win in his first season, but, ever since then, apart from, 1 season, maybe 2 seasons, it's been this sort of, I made this comparison before, and you'll probably remember when, people like Steve Davis in snooker came along and were just so clinically brilliant that they won all the time. But there was little to no personality in what they did, which is doing Steve Davis a disservice, because since then he's turned out to be quite a character and is a DJ and all that kind of stuff. But at the time it was like this dominance. You look at it and you go, well, of course. but it leaves me cold. There's not much I can take from this as a neutral. How many times have you turned on, Sky Sports or TNT or BT or whatever it is at the weekend, and there's a game on and it's Manchester City against someone, and if it's not someone in the top six and they score in the first couple of minutes, you basically go, well, there's no point in watching this. There's no point in watching this. This game is done.
Yeah. I think the Steve Davis thing is interesting as well, because no one is saying that dominance shouldn't happen. But the point is that dominance should come from, it should be rare. It should be something that's special. We are witnessing sporting greatness. And obviously, one of the reasons City are where they are is because they've employed a great squad of players, probably maybe the greatest manager of all time. But that isn't a product of sporting greatness. That's a product of unprecedented financial capacity, which comes from a state's ability and the kind of the wider economy as well. So just two almost distinctive things there.
They've also, deployed an incredible team of lawyers and attorneys and legal people, because throughout the last 10 years or so, there have been these questions. These questions hang over Manchester City, and we know about the 115 charges. We await with bated breath or not, depending on how cynical you are about what's going to happen. The results of that independent inquiry into those 115 charges. There were charges leveled by UEFA at Manchester City. They were found guilty, but got off on technicalities. There were fines, all to do with the leaks from the football leaks stuff. So, City's dominant...
Even before leaks, they had to... they agreed a settlement with UEFA from previous breaches of financial fair play.
Yeah. And
settlements weren't initially in the provisions for those rules, but as football leaks illustrated, they came to those settlements with UEFA after immense or after huge legal threats. And that was the genesis of the famous line about kind of spending 50 million on the 30 best lawyers in the world, or 30 million on the 50 best lawyers in the world.
Yeah, that's it though. You can spend what you want on Erling Haaland, and you can spend all the wages and all, the money that Manchester City have invested into the transfer market, is there. It's open for everybody to see. It's huge. But in order to sort of keep that machine rolling, there is another team in the background, which I think is kind of an unprecedented thing.
Yeah, and I think this is an absolutely key point that probably serves to illustrate all of this. What are the charges or the current APT case, or say the Premier League's difficulty in adjudicating on whether PIF could buy Newcastle? What are all these stories if not a sport's almost impossible struggle to control powers that it's let in that really it can't possibly control, because they can just go to a whole other scale.
Yeah.
And with that, you do kind of come back to first principles of what we're all actually here for. This is where we could get into a whole other strand about kind of what FIFA are actually here for, what they do. But say, why does a club exist? FIFA have actually never articulated that. They've never articulated the basic unit of their sport. But we can sum it up. A club is basically just there to play a game for the purpose of representing a community. And obviously an international level that goes up to countries.
Sure.
That is actually inherently noble, good thing with all sorts of social benefits. We all know that every week when we go to the stadiums. And within that context, all sporting regulation has to do is basically provide a framework where sport can be held fairly. That's it. It doesn't need, or never has needed, to go to levels where the sporting law or sporting rules have to be equivalent of state law, or they have to be as hermetically sealed as state law. But of course, when you let in all these sort of interests who have, and as we can see here, have far greater interest in just the fair running of sport, or the running a sport we've got kind of these competitive games on, that's suddenly when sporting regulation is into areas that it can't possibly deal with. And hence, we're in this mess the football is in right now.
I'll come back to you in a minute about what you think might be next in terms of the Premier League, but there's a lot of stuff in this book, and I don't want to look, a lot of this is hard to talk about. A lot of it is hard to stomach as a football fan for people who love the game, these outside interests that have an impact on the game that we grew up with and the game that we love. But there's, stuff in here about PSG, there's stuff about Neymar, there's stuff about UEFA and FIFA, and you mention autocratic nation states maybe that are in charge of football clubs, but what we have are two organizations who are essentially at this moment in time autocratic in nature as well, in terms of who is leading them and who is making decisions and how those decisions are being made, and what kind of life those people are living because of football and the resources that are in the game. FIFA and UEFA probably have more responsibility for safeguarding the game of football than anybody else. And I think they've fallen short in those regards. And, do you see something, for example, like the Club World Cup, this idea, Philippe Auclair wrote a great piece about it this week in The Guardian. We've read about the struggles of TV rights or engaging people sufficiently for TV rights and broadcasters and sponsors and commercial interests to come on board with this. And there's often been discussion of, let's say, right, there will be a tipping point. There's a saturation point where people will have enough of football. I mean, are we there with the Club World Cup, or is this something that they will fudge through and inevitably, because of the money that tournaments and competitions like this generate, will just continue?
And of course, there's a key point to be made at the Club World Cup as well, which is, the only reason it exists really is because FIFA see the money that UEFA make off the Champions League as well as the influence it has, and they want their own version. And why do they want their own version? Well, I actually think there is a noble idea to the Club World Cup. It's right that more money is spread around the game and that clubs of other continents should be able to compete with Europe. But I don't think this form will necessarily help that. And a lot of people in football ultimately believe that the only reason it's been put in place is because Gianni Infantino wants to raise FIFA's income and revenue so that he can fulfill his election promises, which is more money to the federations. The federations, of course, being his voters. And this is the thing about where football... I agree with, just to answer your last point, there is a danger we're approaching saturation point, and it's just kind of further content. They're all big games, so none of them are big games. It's why actually the expansion of the Champions League comes at such an interesting point in football history, given there's all sorts of potential threats from further super leagues who are almost kind of waiting to see if this fails. I think it has some virtues, the new Champions League. I'm probably on the whole against it. Also, whatever about any of that, the new Champions League basically just solved the wrong problems. People say, oh, it's interesting now where the group stage is boring. But the group stage wasn't boring 20 years ago when, say, Arsenal were having these great games against Lyon and it was really touch and go whether they got through the group. The problem wasn't the group stage is boring. The problem was the financial gaps have been allowed to grow to such an extent that the games aren't competitive enough. And whose fault is that, really? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here, FIFA and UEFA. And this is the thing, to bring that point full circle, that question full circle. We talk about how football already has a problem dealing with powers that it can't possibly control. But it's worse than that, because whatever about trying to solve these problems, the two main authorities in the game, FIFA and UEFA, they've actually already gone the opposite direction. FIFA currently have this partnership, really, with Saudi Arabia, given that they're doing so much with them. Saudi Aramco are now one of their main partners. Infantino has been in Saudi Arabia so often. I write in the book about how he messages MBS, the Saudi Crown Prince, and it's ultimate absolute ruler. Meanwhile, UEFA, and I suppose this is kind of a reflection of other splits, because UEFA and FIFA also hate each other at the moment, which creates other problems. Yeah. But UEFA, well, the president of UEFA, Alexander Chefrin, has this currently burgeoning relationship with Nasser Al-Khelaifi, the key figure at Paris Saint-Germain, at beIN Sport, and also through those roles, or through Paris Saint-Germain, really, the European Club Association, who are the most powerful club body in Europe. But of course, given that he's at Paris Saint-Germain in that capacity, who is Nasser ultimately most answerable to? Well, it's not the game or the objectives of the game. It's the Emir of Qatar. One reason this is all even more important is because FIFA and UEFA have this insane structure where they're both executive presidencies. So it's essentially bestowing the power of the game, in FIFA's case, the World Cup, and maybe the Club World Cup. In UEFA's case, the Champions League, and also to a lesser extent, the European Championships. It's imbuing that power into basically two blokes.
Yeah.
Like these are why are these men afforded such power? And they say, like, isn't to say they shouldn't be in strong administrative rules, but they're essentially like the emperors of football in that way. It's absolutely bizarre, makes no sense, and is one of many factors that have contributed to a whole lot of problems in the modern game.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that these guys have consolidated power in those positions where it's now hyper-political. Yeah. Therefore, there aren't even votes anymore because there's just no point. Is...
Like, it's incredible. Like, obviously, in the book, I go into detail about what happened on that day in December 2010 between, when Qatar and Russia won the World Cup. And, that the investigation into corruption and all that ended up bringing the downfall of the previous FIFA and UEFA regimes. Now we've got to a point in 2024 where there doesn't even need to be a vote because there's been, like, whatever has happened behind the scenes. Well, suddenly we're in a situation where Saudi Arabia has become the only viable candidate for 2034. It's remarkable.
Yeah. One aspect of this, and you do talk about it in the book, I think the chapter is called "Without Fans, the Game is Nothing." I think that's the chapter. And fans, we talk about the authorities in the game and their responsibility to the game, but their responsibility to the fans sometimes is really hard to square the circle. These enormous reserves of wealth that FIFA have, the enormous resources that UEFA has because of the popularity of the Champions League, which generates, I think you say in the book, it generates more than the World Cup for UEFA. It's incredible. And yet we still have incidents like the Champions League final in Paris, which could have been a disaster involving Liverpool, whose history with Hillsborough, brings that into even greater, sharper focus, that all the while they increase revenues and they fly around the world on their private jets and all the rest, the fans are kind of an afterthought, where they can't even invest those resources in putting on the showpiece game of the season from a UEFA perspective in a way which is open and safe and as good as it can possibly be. Instead, we narrowly avoid a situation where dozens, if not hundreds of fans could have been badly injured or killed.
Yeah, and there was similar, if not quite to Paris levels, there was similar for the Euro 2020 final. There was similar for the Europa League 2022 final in Seville. There was similar for the Champions League final that Manchester City played in Istanbul.
What was the one where they just didn't have water? Was that the one in Seville?
Even simple things like that. We're talking about basic organisation in some cases, basic logistics. And a lot of people in football, as I write in the book, they would say that basically comes down to UEFA has become, its priorities have become, they've gone down different directions. There's such a focus now on commercial development, commercial ambition, that not enough on the nuts and bolts. And also, again, to what end is that commercial? Because what we can really see is money just going in one direction, or money basically is increasingly going towards the major clubs. It's so much, and it's one of the things that there were so many moments when I was writing the book where you stand back and actually think, I mean, this is actually a bit of an absurdity where we are, or some of the things we're talking about here, especially given the money that's involved in the game. But then, of course, there's a key line, I think, that pretty much opens and closes the book, which is when the initial founders of the Premier League, a handful of executives, when they were going on fact-finding missions to, say, the NFL to kind of see what works and what didn't. And one of the NFL guys goes to ask them, like, why are you doing this? Well, to make money. And then the answer is pretty much, it's with money you'll have real problems. I think that's pretty much what's happened.
I mean, it is the book itself is, as I said, it's extraordinarily detailed and extraordinarily complicated in places because of just all the influences that are involved, and we've barely scratched the surface of the motivations behind some of this financial involvement. But I come back to fans, and I think, even though there are all these issues and people can recognize the problems, and, fans will always be tribal, the idea of Man City fans complaining about a red cartel when they've won 6 out of the last 7. It's just absurd, really. Yeah. But there is this appetite for the game, that the inherent joy and I don't want to say innocent joy that football can bring, but like you say, it's a game that can be played by anybody. Anyone can smack one in from 30 yards, and enjoy that moment. The appetite for the game has not diminished. The example I would look at is, let's say, the Super League thing, where actually, for a fleeting moment, fans put tribalism to one side and I won't say brought about a change, but certainly put a stop to something that they objected to. Is it possible that fans can do anything to halt this, or are we so far, down the line now that I don't know what comes next. You tell me what comes next, because, after millionaires, it's billionaires. After billionaires, it's oligarchs. After oligarchs, it's nation states. Where do we go from here? How? I don't know. I don't understand, what happens next.
Well, I mean, just one point on kind of the whole issue of fans as well. I mean, obviously, as you know, and you've referenced, I would get a lot, writing about these issues, I'd get a lot of backlash, shall we say, on social media from fans of certain clubs. But like City is probably the most, Newcastle's up there. But my view would still be, regardless of all that, my view is actually a pro-City view. I think it's a pro-club view. I mean, ultimately, personally and professionally as a journalist, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of that social institution, any social institution that should exist for such good, having its identity misused in such a way. And say the Super League even that you've talked about there, okay, it doesn't go to the levels of kind of all the political questions we have with states owning clubs, although obviously City were involved. But what was the Super League, if nothing else, than a group of billionaires who wanted to make more money, hijacking the identity of these clubs for their own ends? That's what it is. I suppose the Super League, I do go into this in that chapter, and it's an interesting one in that for 3 days it was such a powerful moment. I was outside Stamford Bridge that moment where it was announced that Chelsea were going to pull out of it, and there were thousands of fans. It was in the middle of lockdown. Thousands of fans had gathered outside the Brighton game, Chelsea-Brighton, to protest. And then suddenly a scene of protest became a scene of this utter jubilation, as tends to happen. And also, let's not forget, this is a point where Boris Johnson, of all people, is discussing Germany's 50+1 rule in cabinet meetings, which says a lot. Football being football, the game goes on, the energy dissipates. Less than a year later, we have the invasion of Ukraine and Abramovich is sanctioned. A group of Chelsea fans, as I relay in the book, they actually went to the government when it's obviously up in the air who's going to own Chelsea, and they tried to argue, not for outright fan ownership immediately, but more some sort of pathway that might allow in the future. And the Conservative government, despite having literally just been given a lesson in all this, despite just, like, in terms of what happened to Abramovich, in terms of having already agreed to the fan-led review, they had absolutely no interest in it. But that has potentially led to the independent regulator. It's funny, with all of these things, and what I'm talking about, the whole book is really about a 40-year period in football. With all these things, there is often a response in the opposite direction. And I suppose for all that the book goes on about these serious, weighty issues that you've referenced, I do actually think it ends maybe on an optimistic note. And there is kind of, ultimately is about the good of the game in some ways. But I think there are potential kind of forces going in the opposite way. So one is, if the independent regulator is a success, a lot of other major European countries are looking at it and wondering whether they replicate it. If that happens and the idea starts to spread, then that's suddenly a challenge to football's authorities. And suddenly they have to start thinking about how they actually regulate the game themselves, something they don't do enough of. At the same time, and we can see this in, say, City's APT case, the Super League case, and all what initially seem very kind of, headlines that indicate the kind of bad direction the game has taken, and that there's so many off-field court stories and all of this, or so many off-field legal cases. What's interesting about all of those cases is, in many situations, it's bigger powers, be it, say, City on APT, or the Super League on, say, the way European football is run. And they're trying to use competition law as their argument is. In pretty much all of those judgments, though, it doesn't actually go the way those who've taken the case would anticipate, because in every case, it's actually the judgment is called for the strengthening of football regulation. Basically, exactly what we're saying here, that bodies like FIFA and UEFA aren't actually doing their job properly, that they should be more mindful of what football is supposed to be for, which is basically, putting on a competitive sport and for the benefit of wider society. I mean, so these are potential. There's a potential context there for change, and also again, the Super League offers an example. And likewise, in the exact same way, let's say, I mean, the story of this book is really how over 30 years or 40 years, a lot of individual decisions were taken and they were always self-serving decisions, and on their own, they mightn't have been that damaging. It's all taken together. They've obviously led to this transformation of football over 40 years. But that can work in the opposite direction. And examples like this are maybe illustrated that. I mean, it's remarkable. Again, I suppose I often had this thought when I was writing the book. But here we are on a football podcast talking about competition law and government regulation. And this is very. And by the same token, look, I did this book. I got into football journalism because I love football. But ultimately, I find a lot of the job these days, you're talking as much about geopolitics, accounting, law, various aspects of the law. Yeah. I
mean, that's it. I mean, it's whether or not the vested interests that are now so enmeshed within the game of football will allow that regulation to happen, or whether the money will speak. And look, it's all there in the book. There's just so much to get into and so much detail. I did want to ask you one final question, just sort of connected to Manchester City. There's a story this week about a new contract for Pep Guardiola. It's a year with another year on top of that, which, I suppose is terrible news if you're a team that wants to try and win the title anytime soon, but it is what it is. Do you see any connection between that news, that development, and what we are expecting to hear from the 115 charges case, or is that just City consolidating what they already have?
I don't actually see a connection. I think there's a natural tendency at the moment for everyone to think that anything to do with City is pointing towards how this case is going to go. And that in itself shows the importance of this case. I think even the people that aren't too aware of the kind of fine details of it are aware that the stakes of this are huge. And it's almost an existential event for at least the Premier League as we know it. Not that the Premier League is going to fall apart or anything like that, but it could lead to kind of big change. I think City's position is bullish, but then it's always bullish. It's been that way throughout these cases, going back to the initial UEFA one in 2014. So I think they have to act. They are acting as if it's going to be business as usual. But the reality is, and there are so many dimensions to this case that I don't think anyone can say for certain. It hasn't concluded yet. We mightn't even see an outcome this season. I mean, it's funny. I went into this season writing about, in my big kind of 24-25 preview, saying about this could be an unprecedented Premier League campaign because it's possible the league leaders or the champions could suddenly, at a point in April, say, be docked 30 points or more.
Yeah.
I do wonder now whether that will actually happen, because I think the appeal could go on. So no, I mean, the one thing I would say about the Guardiola news right now, what it has done is basically it's suddenly quietened a lot of noise around City. That, like a lot of in their recent defeats, people were naturally linking that to uncertainty over Guardiola's future, whatever about the charges, and the announcement has, I suppose, helped in that regard.
Well, we'll see what happens, of course. I'm not holding my breath on anything, but we'll leave it there. Listen, the book is fascinating. Congratulations. Well done. It's well worth a read for everybody. And thanks for giving me your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much indeed to Miguel. You can find him over on Blue Sky. He's at migueldelaney.bsky.social. The book is called States of Play, and it is out now. We, as we usually do when we talk to somebody who's written a book, we have a couple of copies to give away. I was trying to think of a question which was relevant to what we were talking about, and I was thinking for far too long and I couldn't come up with anything. So we mentioned Stan Kroenke as the owner of Arsenal. So the question to win a copy of States of Play is, what is the name of Stan Kroenke's sort of overall holding company? Is it A, KFC, or B, KSE? You tell me. Difficult one this week. Send your answer, please, to competition@arseblog.com. That is competition@arseblog.com. And we will give you the winners in next week's show. Which brings me very nicely to last week's competition when I spoke to John Sperling about his book, Go to War. And I asked you, what was George Graham's nickname when he was a player? The answer was Stroller. Quite a few people answered Boy George, which maybe they're just having a bit of fun, but still, I was a bit surprised by that. The answer was stroller. The random number generator did its thing, and the winners are Marie Coggin and Bill Smith. So well done to both of you. I'll be in touch. I'll get your details and we'll get those books sent out to you as quickly as we can. Thanks to everybody for your entries and good luck if you're entering this competition. Remember as well that Miguel's book is available in your local independent bookstore and in all good independent bookshops. They'll be happy to order it in for you. States of Play by Miguel Delaney. Right. That is just about that for today's show. For more on our game against Nottingham Forest and a bit more Arsenal-focused conversation, you can join us tomorrow afternoon over on Patreon after Mikel Arteta's press conference, when we have a bit more information about team news, injuries, etc., etc. Myself and Lewis will be there to have a chat about all of that, to look ahead to the game and look ahead to what is a run of fixtures that is now uninterrupted and in which we need to really get ourselves going. The interlulls are done, dusted, and we've got to focus 100% on the Arsenal. So if you would like to get instant access to that and everything that we do on Patreon, it's just $6 a month. $6 a month, and you can sign up at patreon.com/Arseblog. For now, thank you so much as always for being here. Hope you enjoyed the show. Take it easy. You can join myself and James on Sunday this week. We'll have an early Arsecast extra for you this week. That'll be Sunday evening. You can join us for that. In the meantime, take it easy. Have a great weekend. Fingers crossed. And we will catch you on the next one. Until then, cheers. Bye-bye.